How you and your colleagues got interested in this topic of communication and managing communication between parent and teen.
It all started about 20 years ago. If you've ever heard of those ads, it's 10 o'clock, do you know where your parents are? Do you know where your teens are? Right? That was this idea that it's really important for parents to have knowledge about where their teens are. But about 20 years ago, some research came out that said a lot of that knowledge doesn't come from what parents actively do, it comes from what teens are willing to disclose. And because of that, a whole new line of research looking at what leads to adolescent disclosure and secrecy kind of emerged, as well as what strategies parents really do use to try to get that knowledge, in addition to kind of controlling what adolescents can and can't do and asking questions. There are some other strategies like asking important other people or even snooping.
Snooping has even changed in the past 20 years. Can you talk to that just a little bit?
And I think the biggest change in snooping is really with the advent of a lot of technology and technology that adolescents are keeping in their pockets and able to communicate with their friends at any time, able to use Snapchat and things will disappear off the technology. And also how quickly things can be communicated and how permanent and impermanent those communications may be.
With this particular line of research, did you and your colleagues have a theory or a hypothesis?
Well, the main idea here was that there'd been some research on the strategies parents use to gather information, including snooping. There's a line of research showing that snooping's not so effective, especially at getting parents actually the information they want, and it violates some trust, leading to some problems. And there had also been a bunch of research looking at the strategies teens use to disclose or keep secret, but there had been a little bit looking at the combination of those two predicting one another. But what those had done is they kind of combined across lots of families. They hadn't really looked at individual patterns within families and how there are different types of families in the patterns that parents and teens use to kind of both get and then manage that information. Also, we were really interested in including fathers in this study because most of the research has just looked at mainly mothers or parents overall, rather than looking at how these patterns of gathering information and managing information may differ in mother-teen and father-teen relationships.
How did you conduct the research?
We did this all through survey data. This was actually gathered, the data was gathered in upstate New York in the Rochester area. We went to a number of schools in the area, talked about the study, sent home information letters, and then had parents and teens fill out an interest form. And if they were interested, we mailed them a consent form, an assent form for the teens, and then if they returned those back to us with prepaid envelopes, we then sent them links to complete the study online.
How many families did you recruit?
The original study had about 214 families in it, but because this study that we published, we wanted to look at it over time, and about 40 of those were 12th graders at the time, and they left home over that year. We ended up just sticking with the subset that were home for that whole year-long period, and that was about 174 families. And of those, we had about 174 mothers and then about 111 fathers. So we had 111 father-teen dyads and about 174 mother-teen dyads.
What kinds of questions did you ask?
We had a set of questions that asked about lots of different types of topics, like it would say like keeping my room clean, or who I like or have a crush on, or smoking or drinking, things like that. And it would say, okay, how much do you disclose to your parent about these? On like a 1 to 5 scale. And then it would also say, okay, and what strategies do you use if you don't disclose? And they would be able to say, I try to avoid the topic, or I tell them some but not all the information, or I lie, or I disclose everything, right? Which is basically the other side of that. And for parents, it was the same thing. It was basically like, in terms of these topics, What strategies do you use to try to get information about that? I ask my child questions. I observe. I ask other important people. My child tells me everything without me asking. Or I snoop or try to find out without my child's knowledge.
What did you find?
We did something called a latent profile analysis, where we basically took the families and we let the data tell us what groups they fell into. And we found a majority group of mothers and teens that we called open communicators. These mothers tended to get most of their knowledge by asking questions and having their teen tell them without being asked. And then and in that group, the teens mostly disclosed a fair amount, and they also did a little bit of avoidance, but not much of any other of the strategies. Then there was a smaller group, about like 11% or so, who we called indirect communicators. In this group, the teens were doing a lot of omitting some information. So they were still telling, but they were also omitting more information. And the mothers in this group were trying to get information a lot from other figures in the child's life. So they said, oh, my child sometimes tells me without asking. They asked somewhat, but they really sought out other strategies for finding that information by observing and by looking at other people in the child's life. And then there was our problematic families, and those were our covert communicators. These were kids who were doing much more lying, and they also did some avoidance, some only telling partial elements of it. There was less just telling the parents. And parents, in turn, were asking a lot of questions, but they were also doing things like snooping. And so in those families, it seemed like that asking questions wasn't working, right? There was this sort of negative interaction cycle possibly going on. Teens were stonewalling, or parents were asking questions in a way teens maybe didn't like, and so the parents resorted to other strategies to try to find out that information.
What percentage of families in the survey fell into that I lie, I snoop?
The I lie, I snoop, that would probably be about, I think it was like 8.7% of our families. So not a huge amount, but not an insignificant amount of families either.
And on the other end of the spectrum, do you remember how many were full disclosure?
I think that was about 84%.
Did that surprise you?
The thing about that is it wasn't entirely full disclosure. It was a combination of strategies still being used, but there was a lot of good open communication in general going on. And actually, that counter to kind of the traditional idea of what adolescence and the tumultuous relationship looks like, we actually find that the majority of parents and adolescents do maintain relatively positive relationships throughout that period. Yes, there's more conflict. Yes, there's decreased disclosure and increased secrecy, but overall, there's still a lot of positive communication going on, just less than maybe when kids were younger. So we weren't that surprised that we had a majority doing well. But we also expected to find those other groups, and we were, I don't want to say pleased to find them, but it was what we expected to find, and we were happy to be able to look at those groups as well.
What do the findings suggest from looking at those groups?
Maybe not surprisingly, the open communicators had the most positive outcomes. They had the most positive relationships. They also had teens with the least depression, the least problem behaviors. Those were the open communicators. The covert communicators, those were the ones who had the most depression and negative interactions with their parents. Interestingly, they weren't higher in problem behavior, which we actually expected that they might be, because there's an idea that, right, if parents are snooping and teens are lying, they're doing it because there's some sort of problem that the teens are covering up. But there's actually some evidence out there that parents often snoop more in reaction to perceived non-disclosure than actual problems that are going on. And teens often keep secrets in response to feeling intruded upon rather than because there's actually something negative going on.
Is there a cycle then? Is one playing off of the other?
Absolutely. So when parents do more snooping, teens often feel intruded upon. They start to interpret those questions, that solicitation, as just another form of prying rather than a true interest. And they kind of withhold more. And then when teens keep more secrets, parents often do resort to strategies like snooping because they don't feel like they're getting that information in any other productive way.
From the research, what are best practices for parents?
The best practice, which is kind of a cop-out, is have a good relationship with your teen, right? Easy to say, hard to do sometimes, but really it looks like trying to be warm, be understanding, trying to show that you understand what the teen is saying and where they're coming from, really helps promote disclosure in the relationship. And then that disclosure in turn allows parents to talk about these issues with their kids and help them out more, shows kids that they understand. The other best practices are, if you are going to try to, if you want to snoop or something like that, try instead to see if you can set limits, have more, set more control, set rules, I guess. Set rules about if you're going to do this or have this phone, I'm going to look at it every week. So that instead of it being this behind their back snooping, it's a in the open strategy that parents and teens can negotiate and teens are aware that is going to be going on in their life.
If parents feel they have to snoop on their kids, are there some ways to set boundaries so that there's not that mistrust?
Yes. The best thing to do then is, if you feel like you really need to snoop, you're not getting that information any other way, set an open expectation with the teen that, every week we're going to look through your phone history log, so that it's at least not behind their back. There's this honest expectation, and teens can discuss that expectation with the parents and negotiate it rather than it being this full invasion of privacy and violation of trust.
Any other tips for parent behaviors that you would suggest?
I guess the best advice is more open communication leads to more open communication. So if you can talk to your teen about why you feel this desire to snoop, why you feel like you're not getting information from them, and put at least part of the control in their hands and say, what do you think some strategies we could use to make it so that I don't feel like I need to do this? Could you tell me about this? Or could you answer at least 3 questions I ask every day? That might sort of get a pattern going that's a little more healthy within the relationship in terms of communication. If you can come up with, the 3 things or the 4 things or the 2 things that you think are most important that you always know about where they're going or something that happened, and have it be kind of a set rule that these are things that teens always need to communicate about. And that those would make you feel less concerned about what's going on. That would also help, because then it's not that you're constantly prying and asking them these questions, it's this well-known set expectation that these are pieces of information that just need to be communicated.
Did you find a difference in communication styles, first of all?
The main difference with the fathers, we still found those sort of covert father families, and they had similar issues. But the open communicators weren't fully open, actually, in the father-teen dyads. Instead, they were sort of a mix of the open and the indirect. Teens used a lot more avoidance with their fathers in these dyads than they did with mothers in relatively open dyads. But fathers were still using the more adaptive strategies. They were still doing a lot of solicitation, still saying somewhat the teens were telling them without being asked, and they were seeking information from knowledgeable others more, which probably has to do with, there's been some other research showing this, fathers often seek information about what's going on with their teens from the mothers, if mothers are the kind of primary caregiver or monitor. So that may be some of what's going on in those father families, but they were still very adaptive in their outcomes, that majority group where teens aren't openly disclosing quite as much, but fathers aren't going in and trying to snoop.
Any difference in importance in having both parents involved in the information gathering?
We did look at whether there were like links between the different patterns in the mother-teen and the father-teen diets, and what we really found is they didn't predict one another. So there really are different relationships, as I'm sure everyone knows, different relationships with mothers and fathers, and you can have open relationships with one and very covert, problematic relationships with the others, or vice versa, and one doesn't necessarily predict the other.